You're listening to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast, episode number 75. Welcome to the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. I'm your host, Paula Price, lawyer turned certified executive coach. This podcast was created to empower women lawyers just like you to create a life and practice you love. Join me every week for a break from the hustle so we can focus on you, what you truly want, and how you can create it. If you're over the overwhelm, done with putting out fires, and ready to redefine success on your own terms, you're in the right place. Ready for today's episode? Let's dive in. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the podcast. It's Paula here, and I'm so excited to have all of you joining me here this week. We have an amazing guest speaker today. Her name is Gina Alexandris. If you have not met Gina, you are in for a treat. Gina is one of those lawyers who has gone on to have a fascinating and wonderful career. She started out as a civil and family litigator almost 30 years ago, and since that time, she has held numerous positions as educator, as coach, including with various law schools. And she has been working in career development with lawyers for most of that time. And I'm just so excited to have her here on the podcast because she's got a wealth of information and I'm excited for her to share that with you. And in particular, we're going to be talking about emotional intelligence, which is a topic that I think we can all really benefit from learning more about. So Gina, welcome and thank you for joining us on this week's podcast episode.
Thank you, Paula. Thank you for the invitation. And thank you for doing these podcasts. They are fabulous topics, fabulous themes, and great conversations. And so you're doing such a wonderful, have such a wonderful service for so many people to benefit from. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Gina. And I will say that one of the huge benefits for me in doing these podcasts is being able to have guests like you come on, and it gives you an opportunity and a platform to talk about some of the work that you're doing, because I think that this work is so important. And the more people we can reach to share this work with them, the better. So thank you for being here today and for sharing some of, we won't cover it all in under an hour, but some of the work that you've been doing, because I think it's extremely helpful. So to kick off, Gina, I would love for you to share with our listeners some of the work that you currently do, because you've undergone a transition relatively recently. So I'd love to hear more about that.
I would love to share it again. And thank you. And so you're right. Transitions have been part of my almost 3 decades since graduating and getting called to the bar. And right now, since this past summer, I transitioned to a new phase as entrepreneur. I've been an employee for the past several years, all my years. And now I am my own entrepreneur, my own boss as a career and professional development coach. And it's really exciting for me because the role allows me to continue doing two primary things that I really have loved over the various career opportunities that I've had in the past. The one is the one-on-one coaching, being able to sit down with an individual, and typically they are lawyers, law students, or other professionals, and work through with them some of their career goals, some of the challenges that they have, and help them move past any barriers that they might have so they could move forward towards success. That's the one area. And there's sort of, as you know, and as some of our listeners might know, working with a coach, that helps. That has a whole bunch of different nuances. On the other side, one of the things that I've loved in my career is the opportunity to also have workshops and facilitation. I've led workshops, I've taught. And so being able to have that as part of my current experience as well is really, really important to me, because I find while one-on-one has its place and is very important, other people do tend to learn in group settings and larger settings. And I always feel it's not just what I teach others, but what we get from the group that is really, really transformative sometimes. So being able to facilitate for larger organizations or larger groups, or groups individually, or groups that are not common to an organization, various themes and topics is something that I'm doing right now as well. I've got, 3 upcoming webinars, for example, from just individuals joining together in career conversations. But I've also done workshops for organizations, law firms in particular, where certain topics have been the themes of our sessions, and we've worked through them. So I'm really excited for this new phase of my career.
I love it, Gina. And there's so many things that you touched on there. I mean, I think we could do a whole episode about becoming an entrepreneur, and I'm just going to park that thought for now because I've undergone that transformation as well. And it is a wild ride and super fun and relevant, I think, for a lot of listeners who decide to either go out on their own as solo practitioners, or also lawyers who decide to take a new path, which is entrepreneurial, either within the practice of law or outside of the practice of law. So that I think we will need to revisit. The other part of what you were talking about with respect to what you've basically chosen to focus on, right? There's the coaching piece, which really is that one-to-one relationship where you help lawyers or other professionals with specific goals that they have. And then you talked about the education piece where you're teaching in a sense, and you're also teaching in a group environment where there's that opportunity for discussion among the group. And what I think is so neat about the way that you're doing this is I see those two as kind of going hand in hand, because one of the benefits I see about coaching is that we learn things, we know things, and we want to go from A to B. We know that there are steps that we should be taking, that we've told ourselves that we're going to be taking. And yet, if it falls out of our immediate viewpoint, for example, we sort of lose sight of it, or we don't want to do it, and so we just let it drift. It's almost like you can bring those two things together. So I think you being able to train, right, to have that knowledge where you're able to share that, and also then bring that into fruition with the lawyers or other professionals that you're serving, I just think it bridges a gap, that sort of that knowledge versus action gap. And I imagine that comes in really, really handy in both respects, right? The two kind of feed on each other. And Gina, you mentioned just before we started recording too, that you're almost at 3 decades, which is so amazing because it highlights the wealth of how long you've been working with lawyers, how long you've been serving within the legal profession. And I would love to know, just for the benefit of some of our listeners, some of what you have done over the course of your career, the positions that you've held, and how you've worked with lawyers over the course of your career.
I think, as we were talking before we started, when the number of 30 years came up, next year in 2023 is the 30th anniversary of my call to the bar. And the first thing that I'll say is that it flies by. It can really fly by. I can't believe it's been that long. The second thing is just the reminder to all listeners that things don't happen overnight. Things do take time, and experiences take time. And sometimes I've been in a situation where I've wanted change, or I've wanted something to happen, and it takes some months or some years sometimes. So I'll just sort of park that, because 30 years sounds like a lot, and it is, but it doesn't happen just immediately. So I think just that reminder for everybody. But I've been blessed really to have had a number of different really exceptional opportunities. One of the words that I truly love, and people that I speak with will know this, is the word serendipity. And while I've been such a planner, and I think a lot of what we do in coaching and in law necessitates planning, being open and having a mindset of openness to allow for those chance opportunities that you didn't really expect in your plan has been sort of a theme for me over the course of my career. So as you said, I started off in a small litigation firm and I focused on civil litigation and family law combination. I had intended to become a teacher. When I was in high school, if you'd asked me, I'd say I would be going into education. And it wasn't until university when my parents had a commercial tenants, they're small commercial landlords. There was a commercial tenancy issue, and they were embroiled in this lease issue. And unfortunately, their own lawyer oftentimes responded and acted in a way that I felt was completely inappropriate, making my mom cry, not explaining things, getting me to do everything that he didn't want to do. And it made me pivot and say, I didn't want other people to experience the type of service or lack thereof that my parents were getting. And I think that was sort of a theme for me. I wanted to be able to help people, especially those who may not have had access to legal services, get the legal services that they deserved, and in a way that was appropriate. And I think that was always a theme for me. So I got into law school, worked in a small firm, which also had very much of an impact for me, because within the context of my practice very early on, I also was required, and grateful for it, to deal with practice management issues, marketing issues, dealing with clients really from day one until I left practice. Those were experiences that I had, and they really did impact a lot of other things that I've done since then. But something wasn't sitting right in practice for me. And, 25 years ago, not sure what that was. People kept saying, oh, no, you've just got to get over the learning hump. Once you get over that learning curve, you'll feel much better about the practice of law. And it really wasn't something that I felt I was experiencing. And in fact, when I read this job ad in my 4th year of practice, after having gone to a career coach who reminded me something that I'll come back to, I saw this job ad to start the career services office at Osgoode Hall Law School. The law schools in Canada were unlike what they are now. They did not have career development or career services offices. And the Osgoode office was going to be opening up. And it just resonated with me. It was almost the perfect job. Literally, it was sort of jumped off the page. And I thought, I'm applying for this. And through a few hoops and uncertainties, got the position and was ecstatic. I was nervous about leaving the practice of law. We can leave that for another conversation. But when I started thinking about the role, I would get really excited and I jumped at it. And it was great being back in an educational institution because I think my first love of education was always there. It had remained. But I worked in setting up the career services office, worked in setting up and helping sort of set up the group of career professionals in schools and in law firms as well. It's a really great machine now, but they didn't exist in the past. So it was really wonderful being sort of on the ground floor. And then there was an opportunity that was it was the 3rd time in 4 years that the assistant dean of student services position was becoming available at Osgoode. And my initial thought was, oh, I'm too junior. I'd be supervising my peers. I don't know anything about these other areas. But I thought, let me take a chance. And luckily, somebody took a chance on me. Our dean at the time took a chance on me. And I got the role and was in that role for about 9 years. And it was a phenomenal role where every year I got to meet, about 200 new people with new dreams, new experiences, help develop programs, both curricular and extracurricular programs. It really was a wonderful opportunity. And I thrived in that role. Not that it didn't have challenges, but I thrived in that role. One of the things that was missing for us, though, I had always felt was that any internationally trained lawyers that were coming into Canada had to go through a whole bunch of different hoops or did not have hoops to actually go through. And at that point, around the 11th or 12th year when I was in this role, U of T got some funding for the creation of something called the Internationally Trained Lawyers Program. And something, again, just spoke to me. And I thought, oh, I'm leaving the certainty of this job that I have. I really liked it. There was nothing pushing me away from it, but there's something pulling me towards the ITLP role at U of T, and jumped at it, took it, started. Again, I remember the first day I had an entrepreneurial experience, even though I wasn't an entrepreneur. By that, I mean, I had to set up the office. I had, a box as a desk and a telephone. And then we had to set up the office, get the curriculum running, etc. It was a great team at the U of T that I worked with, great group of students that we were working with. And it opened up a door to me that I had never thought about, which was internationally educated professionals, and being able to collaborate at U of T with other groups that were focusing on different professionals was really an eye-opener, and it was really quite exciting. I'll fast forward. There was one blip year, as I say to many people. I took a role after the ITLP at the Ministry of the Attorney General, and it was for a couple of reasons. One was because I was asked, somebody came to me and said, we have a retirement request. Would you like to fill it? And it was a positive ego boost to be asked that. But more than that, it was also the ability to figure out what was happening internally at MAG. It was the largest employer of lawyers in Ontario, and I really didn't have much of a sense of the work that they did. And that year for me was really quite a learning opportunity, because I got to see and learn and appreciate the tremendous work that public service lawyers do on a daily basis, and the variety of work that happens in provincial government. But the call to education again came back. Then Ryerson, now TMU University, was setting up a proposal and a bid for starting a program that was parallel to articling, that would allow a different pathway to articling for Ontario licensing candidates. And again, speaking with a couple of people who were involved at that time, I got excited and I thought, the ability to start something brand new again to help serve a population that was getting sort of not full services in the past was really exciting. And so when they got the contract with the Law Society, I moved over to Ryerson and started that program. We, again, entrepreneurial was definitely there because we had only one other staff member, no office space. So going through all of the logistics of that part of it, as well as developing a program, the relationships that needed to be built, the program curriculum itself, and members of the profession to come in as adjuncts was really, really critical. And along that path, the university also decided to try for a law school. So I'd been at Osgoode, I'd been at U of T. And if you'd ever told anybody during those two positions that there would also be a law school, a third law school in the city of Toronto, we would say, no, of course not. But there was that opportunity to try and put the bid in. And I worked really closely with three others and a group of other individuals, but four of us in particular for about 3 years. And this was while I was also doing the LPP, put together the proposal to the various levels of approval that were needed. And I got the true honor and pleasure of being able to see a law school come to life at Ryerson at TMU and start working a little bit with the incoming students for the first cohort who are about to graduate this coming spring. And things sort of came full circle. And it was sort of when that was up and running with the LPP up and running, I thought, okay, now I want to take all of this experience and be able to share it in a different way with a broader audience rather than just sort of the audience that is specific to each institution that I'm dealing with. And that's sort of a nutshell of the 30 years experience.
It is so wonderful, Gina. And I love listening to your story. I notice a few themes here, and I'm about to ask you what themes you have drawn, but I can't help myself because when you tell your story, it's so clear that you are listening to what is of interest to you, right? You talked about having this early passion for teaching and that just kept on coming back even after you had started out as a lawyer. And it seems like you are truly called to build. It's the project initially in career services over, I think you said it was Osgoode. Is that right?
That's correct.
Exactly. So you're starting out at Osgoode and then you're building that program for the internationally trained lawyers and you're building over at Ryerson. Now, I think it's
TMU.
It's TMU. Mm-hmm. So there's this pattern of building and following something. And when you described looking at that job posting as a 4-year call, looking at the job posting and it actually like resonating with you, mm-hmm. I think that's such a key point. And for anybody who's listening, who's thinking about making a move or looking at different options or different jobs, that to me is one of the litmus tests. When you're looking at a job description and there are certain bullet points on the page that your eyes, like, it's almost like they leap off the page. Do you see them highlighted in bold without them being any different in font? It's like following that, I think, is such a telltale way of almost finding your path, right? You talked about the planning, the serendipity. It's those two things coming together, right? It's knowing that you've got a plan, but also allowing that grace for what's coming that you could not necessarily have predicted. So I just wanted to make those comments and to turn it around to you, Gina, and to ask you, in the work that you have been doing in terms of looking at it from your own career development and the career development of all the students and the lawyers that you've been working with, what are some of the common themes that emerge from your perspective?
So the one thing that I want to just to sort of clarify or just a reminder to people is that when I saw that job ad, it wasn't as if that was the first time that I thought I want to transition to another role. It had come after several months to close to a year of working with a coach at that time when they didn't really exist, but I sort of somehow found somebody who was doing career coaching for professionals, thinking about what was important to me. And the aha moment for me was probably in my third meeting with this woman when she was quite at that point, I say older, and I'm now thinking, yeah, that's sort of probably around my age, but she was an older professional woman, almost very conservative in her presentation. And she asked me this question. She says, "Are you having fun at work?" And I looked at her, I thought she forgot what I was doing. I said, "Remember I told you I was a lawyer. I'm not allowed to have fun." And she looked at me and laughed. And she said, "Yes, you are. The fact that you feel you aren't or you can't tells me that there's a misalignment." It was the first time that I really thought about that. And one of the things that was coming up for us in our conversations was that the things that I was doing in an extracurricular basis. So I was teaching introductory contracts law, which was torts and contracts, to accounting students in a college setting. I was helping the Ontario Bar Association in a couple of different sections set up annual learning activities and regular teaching activities. Those were the things that I was really finding that I was getting a thrill in, but those are all after hours. The things that I was enjoying in my practice was communicating with the clients, being able to give them some information and advice. The part of litigation that meant making a presentation, I was finding that still enjoyable, but there are other elements that I wasn't. So the whole process of getting to that job ad wasn't sort of overnight. It happened that I opened up the page at the right time, not that I didn't see it, but it took several weeks and months of me sort of trying to figure out what was important and reminding myself what was important. And along the way, I'd applied to other jobs, Paula, where they were very similar roles to what I was doing. And I was doing it just because I needed this change, I felt. But I wasn't really paying attention to the other work that I had done in terms of what I should be looking for. And they'd always fall flat. I'd get the offer. And then a couple of days later, I'd have to call back and say, no, thank you, because it would be the same thing that I was involved in. I liked the people I was working with. I loved the people I was working with. There was something different. So just a way of reminding people that sometimes timing, it happens quite quickly, but other times there's work that goes into figuring out what it is that you're searching for and why you're searching for it. And so that education piece, really important to me. I think being that immigrant kid whose parents had less than high school, dad only had a grade 3 education before the war hit. Mom only finished grade 7. That idea of getting an education was sort of ingrained in me. And the ability I was also the nerdy young aunt who, whenever I'd have to babysit, my 2 little nephews unfortunately got, let's do classes. Let's pretend we're in school. And so that was a theme throughout. And I think the fact that I have done professional development, career development, education in different contexts has always been very clear to me once I started looking at it. The other theme that I said, and you're very right, the building and the creation is something that I only realized probably before I went to Ryerson. I hadn't really made that connection of the different jobs that I did, but I really do like creating. And that's one of the reasons why I said earlier, I love the one-on-one, but I also still like the ability to have that creation of programs and thinking about how people will learn and participate together. I think that's really quite important. And the only other part that I think, there's a few other things, but the other theme that I'll raise right now is along the way, in terms of the group that I really resonate with, maybe it was because I was that immigrant kid. Maybe it was because I had a lot of moments of otherness. I think when I think about the programs and the work that I do, where I gravitate more tends to be with people who have felt that in the past as well, right? So whether it is the internationally trained lawyer, whether it is the first generation student, or whether it is the person who has never experienced corporate life and is now getting a job in a corporate law firm, whether it is a woman who is the only woman around the table of a group of 10 men, for example, it's always been something that has drawn me to bring out the confidence, the comfort, the belief in themselves of folks who may have either been told or maybe telling themselves that they can't do it. I think that's been a significant theme, and respecting that and working with that, I think, is really, really important.
Just so powerful, Gina. I fully appreciate that and love that you shared that with everyone who is listening. Just wanted to circle back because I think this is really a key point as well that you just made when you talked about that job description and it not just landing on your desk out of the blue, that there had been a year of work leading up to that where you were speaking with a career counselor or coach, figuring out what it was that you were drawn to outside of business hours. I think for everybody who's listening, who's thinking about that type of transition or making a transition, those are really, it's not a decision that's necessarily an overnight thing. I don't think the answer, as far as I've experienced, rarely comes like, like the lightning bolt that all of a sudden, tells you the answer. That it does take a lot of introspection to get there and to look at what you're doing outside of work. What are you doing that you don't need to be paid to do? You just love it. Those are some really good clues. And it seems like you've taken what you were doing almost as, the extracurriculars, and you've made that the central focus, which I imagine for you, it seems, is really rewarding for you. You seem really energized by your work. You're passionate about it. You see the why behind it, right? You can see where the passion is, right? Even in what you were just talking about, like finding those people who, whether it's a first generation lawyer or somebody who's new to Canada, and just helping them find that space and to build that confidence within themselves. So I just think it all ties together so beautifully. And I'm so delighted that you're sharing your story with us. So thank you. Gina, we were planning, and I think we still are planning to talk about emotional intelligence.
Yes.
And this is a topic that I understand you've been teaching about lately, in particular to lawyers. And so I would love to know what it was that got you interested in emotional intelligence initially.
So one of those serendipitous moments, really. A few years ago, it was probably the first or second year that we were doing the law practice program at Ryerson, what was then Ryerson. And because the program was primarily online, I was looking for an online course to do so that I could experience the student's perspective. And I don't know if people remember or know, but one of the platforms at that time, and they still do have programs. There's been a huge uptick in programs offered in this way, but Coursera was offering free courses and the ability to participate online. And so I thought, okay, let me try it. I want to see what it's like to participate in a program online, get some tips from it. So I wanted to be the learner so I can then turn around and help sort of implement or improve some of our student or candidate experiences. So the course that I fell on was, oh gosh, I'm forgetting the exact title, but it was Emotional Intelligence and Leaders. I don't know what emotional intelligence is, but leadership is always something that was important because we're building lawyers to move into various professional roles where they'll be leaders. So I thought, yeah, let me try it. And it was a phenomenal course from just how it was set up. The instructor, a prof from Case Western University, I did not think it would be possible. He had students from across the globe, and it was one of the most subscribed courses. There were thousands of us. And he had people who were on the chat rooms every single week, wondering about what the next stage would be or what the next course would be, or talking about how he engaged us the week before. And it was incredible to watch how he did it. The what was also really powerful for me. It was a concept that I really hadn't thought about. And we'll talk a little bit about what emotional intelligence is, but I brought that back as I've done, when I did my higher ed, I would take things that I was learning in the classroom and bring that back to the office, and vice versa, take what I was doing in my day-to-day life and take it into my classroom. And so I brought it to my wonderful boss, Chris Bentley at the time, and I said to him, I'm doing this course, and there's something about this program where I think lawyers are missing this message. And he wasn't sure. He said, what is it about? And I told him a little bit about it. And he says, well, let's do a presentation to the first year. So it was the second season, the second round. He says, we've got one coming up. Let's just do an hour and see how it lands. So he gave me that flexibility, first of all, to be able to try it out. So to anybody who's listening who might have been in that second cohort, yes, you were a little bit of guinea pigs in that instance, but it actually landed really well. And so from that point onwards, I kept reading about it, learning more about it, and every year doing an emotional intelligence workshop for our candidates and trying to add different elements throughout the program. And when we were putting together the law school proposal, one of the things I'm really happy and proud about this, I did a whole bunch of research to see where this was landing in the States, in Canada. No other university or law school had a mandatory emotional intelligence course. There were some ABA or Canadian Bar Association, so American Bar Association, Canadian Bar Association workshops, but there wasn't anything mandatory. And so I thought, I have nothing to lose. I pitched a mandatory intensive on the two elements that from my previous job at the Internationally Trained Lawyers Program, I realized they sort of go hand in hand. An emotional intelligence and cultural intelligence intensive workshop, mandatory for all students in their third year. So before they leave law school, to have at least a space where they could have this conversation. And it was accepted. It was something that they put forward as part of the proposal to receive the approval for the program. And this past fall, I got to teach the first EQCQ course to law students at the University at Gina Alexandris School of Law. And I thought they were engaged, I was engaged, and I'll explain sort of why I think it's so important for lawyers and what it is as well very soon. I get very, very emotional about it. I should control that a little bit. So I get very emotional about
it is fabulous because I think we often talk about the things you were never taught in law school. Mm-hmm. This is one of those things. What a huge benefit to have that education before you start practicing. So how would you define emotional intelligence?
So at its simplest, and I don't want to give a lengthy explanation, at its simplest, it's really a set of skills. And that's really important to remember because it means that it can be learned. So it is a set of skills that allows each and every one of us to do two things. So one is to turn inwards and to really be able to understand, acknowledge, and manage our own emotions. And very importantly, also, it's the second part is to be able to understand, recognize, and manage other people's emotions that are around you as well. So really fundamentally, it's thinking about and coping or acknowledging or managing those things that we don't talk about in law school, right? Or in law, the emotions that happen on a day-to-day basis. And I'll give you some examples as we move forward if you want.
Beautiful. Yeah. And I think that it's such a beautiful topic for lawyers, especially because my experience of law school, which I think was pretty standard, was it was really the emphasis was on law, right? Learning law, the logic, the kind of the facts. And I think what this is it's just looking at it from a completely different lens. It's giving space to the emotional component. And we're all humans practicing law. We're not robots. And so how do we deal with that humanness? So I'd love to know from your perspective why you think this was something and is something that matters for lawyers.
Paula, you just hit it on the head in terms of why it's important. In law, we're a service profession, right? We deal with people. That is what our work is. Yes, we deal with cases, and yes, we deal with contracts, and yes, we deal with paper and so many other technical things, statutes that we have to deal with. And those are very fundamentally important. But when you bring it down to it, all of that starts with somebody sitting across you, whether it's live or virtual, telling you that they have an issue, telling you that they have a problem, you trying to figure out what that problem is. And then you having to work with others to come up with solutions for it. And then you have to work with potentially opposing others to resolve something for more than just one party, for two parties. And so fundamentally, and then let's just take a broader systemic perspective, you have a community, you have a society that is trying to figure things out, and you're involved in it from a legal perspective. And so the fact that there are so many relationships involved in law is a huge red flag that should we not figure out how to deal and how to cope with these different relationships? When I do the workshops, I oftentimes ask people, what are the different relationships that people have, even as a sole proprietor? So if you think that you're on your own, you don't have to worry about this. You start then thinking about who you deal with on a regular basis, even as a sole proprietor. You have clients, you have other collaborators potentially, you have opposing counsel if you're working on a client file, you have government offices that you're dealing with, you have support staff that you might need to bring in, even if it's part-time, you have the court staff that you have to deal with. And so thinking that you are completely an island onto yourself and you don't have to interact with anybody else is a fundamental flaw, I think, as we're thinking about it. And as I, over the years, I've refined my thinking as to the why lawyers need this. And there were two other pieces that probably about 2 or 3 years ago, as I refined my thinking over it and my presentations, there were my aha moments. And I'll start with the second one first as I'm thinking about it, because every year I would have our provincial insurer come in and do a session for our candidates. And every year, without fail, the information that was coming up was that the top 2 reasons for client complaints to the insurer against lawyers were the same year after year after year, the biggest complaints. And they weren't not knowing the law necessarily. What they were client communications and time management or practice management issues. And without fail, every year, those were the 2 things that kept coming up. What are clients coming to the insurer for and saying, my lawyer couldn't or didn't or wouldn't? It was poor communications and poor time or practice management. And when you think about that in terms of how emotions impact those things, which we'll come to in a bit, it made sense. If lawyers aren't thinking about how their work, how their interaction. I'll go back to what I said earlier. The lawyer who almost lost my parents as a client and was my inspiration in a off kind of way of going to law school was because he had very poor people skills, very poor communication skills, and managing the time that was needed to be able to deal with clients. So that information from our legal insurer was sort of a practical why. Then one of the things that we do at the law practice program was look at the rules of professional conduct. So whichever province or state, if anybody's elsewhere listening from elsewhere, there are always rules of professional conduct that apply to lawyers and that govern our requirements and responsibilities as a profession. And as I was digging down into them, there were some things that kept coming up. So I'll just use BC and Ontario as two examples. Both have Chapter 3s, which deal with clients, our interaction with clients. Chapter 5 for both of the rules of professional conduct for both provinces is the administration of justice. And BC uses the word courtesy as well as part of it. And so that's sort of how we interact with other players in the justice system. Ontario has a 6th and a 7th chapter, which deal with relationships to students, employees, and others. So right up front, it's right there. And then in Chapter 7, relation to the Law Society and to other lawyers. So in the rules of professional conduct themselves, our regulators have indicated that we need to be aware of how we conduct ourselves and being mindful of the impact that emotions will have on how we conduct ourselves is really, really critical. So when you start looking at the why, apart from it's nice to know, right? Apart from the fact that it's good to have good people skills, good, and I don't like the word soft skills, but because it's what most people hear, good soft skills, understand how being considerate and friendly, and it doesn't have to be friendly, but assertive sometimes, but not aggressive, understanding the impact and how is just a good to have. However, it's also a must-have when you're thinking about the responsibilities that we have as lawyers in the profession. And for that reason, I was shocked and surprised that we don't talk about it even more.
Beautiful. I think you explained that so beautifully. Gina, what are some practical examples where emotional intelligence comes into play?
So everywhere. And I keep saying this, and I'm going to borrow some examples that other lawyers, when I've had them on panels, think about and bring it forward. But I'll give you just a few examples. How do you conduct your client intake, right? Just that whole process. What forms do you use? What language do you use for those forms? What is the type of question or the language that you're going to use for that question? What are you being taught in terms of how to welcome your client into your office? What kind of comfort items are going to be in the office? Are you going to be mindful? I'll give you an example. Our estates lawyer always used to talk about having a box of Kleenex in the office because estates can get pretty emotional. I used to have a box of Kleenex in my office unknowingly at the time, but because it was very emotional for people, and being ready to deal with those emotions that might come up during an initial intake meeting are critical. So that entire client intake, and let's also put the other thing in, managing your time. If you've got half an hour with that client or an hour with the client, being able to interview them and know what to ask, when to pause, when to move forward with them, being able to ensure that you've talked money in that very first meeting, knowing whatever emotions you have about money. And we all bring different, most students that I talk to do not like having the money conversation with clients, but it's so important from the perspective of information, the perspective of understanding, of business perspective from the lawyer's side. But if we feel queasy about it, we need to be able to address that. We need to be able to move forward. The other example I'll give you, just I could go on with different examples, but the other example is very commonly in negotiations. Negotiations are often fraught with emotions of yourself. Oh gosh, I'm not good enough. I'm not strong enough. I'm too forceful. I'm not aggressive enough. I don't have all the information. My client's going to lose it. All these thoughts that are playing in your own mind as you're trying to prepare yourself for negotiations. Then you have your clients, and then you have the opposing counsel and maybe their client as well. And so you've got, at a minimum, 4 people and then you have, if it's a negotiation that is just between you and the other side, or if it's a mediation where you have a decision maker, there's somebody to factor into as well. So thinking about how you will conduct yourself, how you'll control your emotions, how you'll manage the emotions of the room, always fundamentally with a key aim of success for yourself and for the parties that are involved. Those are two really broad examples, Paula, of where emotions land in a legal practice on a daily basis, or on a regular basis, at least.
Yeah, I think you've highlighted it so well. And when you said money, I was like, yes, that is one of those areas where when you need to have that conversation about invoicing and how it's going to work, that is a very uncomfortable conversation for a lot of people. You talked about negotiations, right? When you're dealing with opposing counsel, when you're dealing with your client, when you're dealing with the mediator, if you're in a litigation environment, for example, it can be really high conflict. I mean, there are all these situations where the emotional component of it comes into play, and to have training and tools so that you can recognize it within yourself, you can recognize it within others, and then have tools and strategies to deal with it. I think you talked about the voices inside your head, right? As you're sitting down to do that thing that maybe the first time you've gone to court, or it's a difficult conversation to have with the client and you're almost talking yourself out of it. Being able to manage all of that is a huge part of any professional practice. And I think especially for lawyers who are dealing with these challenging situations, you're taking on your clients' problems and helping them with it. So I think for anybody who's practicing law and in other professions as well, it is such a key element to the work that you're doing.
And Paula, sorry, just we think about it that if we're really good at drafting, or if we're really good at reading the law and interpreting the law, that's really important to do. You absolutely have to have that. And so one of the things that is often a reminder that I give as a reminder is knowing the law and being able to do the law well is sort of a starting point. We assume that everybody has that. What will set people apart then are those additional skills that we referenced, right? The emotional intelligence and even cultural intelligence. I'll leave that for the time being. But being able to do the job well, but also being able to do the job well with the people involved. It's the difference between alienating a client, an opposing counsel, a judge, a staff member, versus being able to, you might get that, and think about your own experiences, right? How many of us have known or worked with individuals who are good technically, but they may not move ahead or may not get the job that is next or get the client because their people skills, their emotional intelligence is so low that while they can do the job technically, that's not enough anymore. You've got to have that additional layer.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think we see that sometimes when we talk about corporations hiring, right? It's not a corporation that hires you. It's an individual person that hires you. And I think with law, it's the same. Every action that you take, every communication, every step, it's human to human. I guess there's times where you're filing, it's electronic. Maybe there's that distance there, but for the most part, we're still operating with humans. And so it's important to know how we can relate better to each other. You mentioned, Gina, that these are skills, right? Emotional intelligence is a skill, and the beauty of skills, of course, is that you can actually build some of them. And some people seem to be born with these innate skills. They, gracefully navigate their way through relationships from the get-go, it seems. And for others, it's more of a struggle. And so what are some ways, if you struggle with emotional intelligence, that you might be able to build those skills if it doesn't really come naturally for you?
Great question. I think the first part is even just recognizing or acknowledging it, right? Understanding that it's a critical skill to have in your tool chest and your practice. And so I think that's a really critical first step, understanding that you may or may not have certain skills associated with it. So being able to identify and acknowledge, I think, is critical. The second part that I oftentimes talk to our students or my clients about is developing a greater emotional vocabulary. How many times when you're asked the question, how are you doing today? You'll say fine, or I'm okay, or oh, I'm a little tired. Well, is that giving the other person enough information that they need to? And maybe in the question of how are you doing, it's easy enough. But when we expand our vocabulary a little bit to be more precise, to be more accurate. So I'm not tired, I'm exhausted. Think about the difference between the person who responds with tired and I just saw your eyes go up, right? Tired and exhausted tells you something different. I'm happy, I'm ecstatic, I'm content. Those three, you might say happy just as a word, but those three different words can give different experiences and different results from that impact. And so being able to expand our vocabulary and clarifying what we are experiencing or what we're seeing others experience, I think is critical. So having that larger vocabulary we tend not to think about emotions. And, in this day and age, I've got to say this, we will do so with emojis, but we won't actually use the words. And I find if you have to start with emojis and figuring out what the emojis are, all right, start. That's a good starting point. But then start using that as you're expressing your own emotions. The other two elements that I'll say, the other two ways of learning, there are three that I'll just really quickly talk about. One is our listening skills. Oftentimes, our emotions will impact if we're really paying attention, if we're concentrating on what the other person is saying, if we are giving them our full attention, or if we're distracted. And so being able to practice your listening skills is really important. Just recognizing how important that is in terms of what you might be missing and what you might be communicating, thinking about if you're distracted and it's showing, your client is going to think you're not caring about them. And so what message is that sending your client? And so being able to develop your listening skills, and there's a few different exercises, for example, to do that is really important. One of the ways that I really like is getting two people together. And so you sometimes do have to work with other people, getting two people together and each person speaking for 5 minutes without the other person participating. For the listener, it really means having to focus and not think about what you want to say or how you want to respond or how you want to pop in and interject. It really is just giving the person the space to say whatever it is that they need to say. So I think that listening is a critical skill to have that impacts emotional intelligence. The other elements of emotional intelligence would be being able to deal with the unexpected or deal with challenges. How well do we do that? And part of that is we sometimes get into our comfort zone. And you've probably seen this or heard it done. There's two examples which I like to use. I usually cross my hands in one way. And we're not going to show this to people, but I cross the hands in one way. And if anybody asks me to cross my hands the other way, I literally cannot do it. Like I am not able to easily do that. So I don't know if you've ever tried the crossing your hands in the opposite direction session, or when something as simple as taking a different route in the morning to your favorite coffee house, or to when you're dropping off the kids, changing the usual pattern that you're involved with to be able to react to something new, to something different. Those are sort of some simpler ways of being able to think about how you impact and how you can improve your emotional intelligence. And ultimately, there's so many wellness conversations. And so I'm grateful to the different groups and organizations that have wellness talks with students and with lawyers, because fundamentally regulating our emotions also necessitates those various wellness concepts that we are becoming more and more familiar with. So whether it's deep breathing, meditation, journaling, exercise, a walk out in nature, a talk to a friend, a good cry session, speaking to a trusted person, all of those ways where we could regulate our emotions so that they're not impacting us in a negative way, but rather we bring them forward in a very positive way to others. So those are just some of the examples of how and what we can do to improve the emotional intelligence that we bring to the work. The other, I'll just say this for any listener, being aware of how our own emotions will impact us with time management. And you've got so many different sessions on time management. So thinking about why, the why of disorganization, the why of procrastination, and being mindful of that and taking the strategies that you suggest, for example, for time management, and applying those that will better help not only our own feeling about it, but also our practice and the practice management that we bring to it.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. Thank you, Gina. And just to recap, I love this. It's really developing that emotional lexicon. And I think you can find these resources online. I'm pretty sure I've seen these before, where you can literally Google, like, what are some different emotions? And there will be sheets, because we don't have a very granular way of looking at emotions unless we start to cultivate that. So I think that's beautiful, to increase the particularity with which you can express yourself and understand yourself and others. Listening, so underrated. Thank you for highlighting that. And then this notion of being flexible and trying new things, crossing your arms a different way, taking a different route. So I love all of this. And Gina, and thank you. The time management too. I think there is that emotional component to it. And I wish we had more time, because I think we could, again, have a whole episode on the relationship between time management and the emotional conversation that's going on there. But we have time for one last question. And this question I love because it's actually your question. And for the benefit of our guests, Gina and I had the pleasure of, or I had the pleasure of working with Gina this summer on a project. We were co-coaches and we shared some of our resources. And Gina had this beautiful question. And now I have this opportunity to ask it of her with the world listening. So Gina, no pressure at all. But here's a question, and I encourage everyone listening to think of this question for themselves too. It's a beautiful question. Look forward 20 years. You are attending a function where someone is giving a speech about you. What would you want them to say?
Paula, thanks for asking, for turning that around, because I haven't answered that question probably since I worked with my coach way back when, or did my coach training. And when you said that I should think about this, what stage am I at now? I've got this new chapter. I'm a little bit older, but I think fundamentally the same things still come up for me. I hope that people say she was her authentic self in everything that she did. I hope people say that I was respectful and fair to all those that I work with, that I collaborate with, that I come across with. I hope that they say that I made a difference in how people view themselves and their pathways in their careers, and were able to help them gain some confidence and move forward. And I guess at that stage, 20 years from now, I also hope that perhaps I made a little bit of an impact on our system as well, not just on the individuals, but systemic changes as well, because it's really important for us to think about the individual, but we all know that we're all part of a larger system. And I think there's some things in our legal profession that are working really well and other things that we need to change. And I hope that I could move the dial on that a little bit as well in the next 20 years.
So beautiful, Gina. And I think everyone listening agrees that you are doing all of those things. I imagine there are listeners right now who have felt an impact based on the stories that you have shared. And I think we've seen, in terms of, one thing I would add to that, although it's maybe building on your last point, that you are leaving institutions different from relative to what they were before you arrived. And so I think there's so much that you've done already, and I'm so excited to see what else is in store for Gina Alexandris. I'm so delighted, and I'm so glad that we know each other, and I have the privilege of being able to chat with you and have you here today and to share some of your story with our guests.
Likewise, Paula, it's been a pleasure. And I love the work that you are doing and what you're putting out in the world for so many people. So continue doing that and bring yourself to others in such a beautiful, graceful, professional way. And thank you for your comments. This has been fun.
Thank you so much, Gina. Thank you. Thank you. That means so much to me. And Gina, please, where can we find you? You are available on...
Yeah. On my website, GinaAlexandris.com. So GinaAlexandris.com. And by all means, there's a contact there to get in touch with me with my email. And I'm also on Instagram, LinkedIn, and not as much Twitter these days. So Instagram and LinkedIn are the two best places, other than my website and through my email found on the website. Thanks so much, Paula.
Beautiful. Thank you, Gina. And we'll provide links to all of those things in the show notes to today's episode. And thank you again, Gina. It's been such a pleasure having you here. Thank you to everybody who tuned in this week. I know you've enjoyed this conversation as much as I have. And Gina, we'll have to have you back. I think that's just the only thing.
Love to be back. Thanks so much, Paul. Thanks everyone for listening.
Beautiful. Thanks so much. Take care.
All righty.
If you enjoyed today's show and don't want to miss an episode, subscribe and follow the show wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you haven't already, please leave a rating and review. Your feedback will help me create a podcast that's tailored to your needs and goes straight to the heart of what matters to you. For instructions on how to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com/podcast launch. See you next time. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Joyful Practice for Women Lawyers podcast. If you want more information, visit www.thejoyfulpractice.com. See you next week.